Professor Jones, you spoke about police reform, but you specifically spoke about police abolition. Can you describe what that really means and where it fits into the national dialogue today when it comes to police reform?
Sure. So when we think about police abolition and its emergence in popular culture, that really comes in recent emergence in summer 2020, when for the first time abolition as a response to police violence kind of pushes aside the popular paradigm of police reform, and especially progressive police reform. And so what does police abolition mean, right, was a question that a lot of people had at the time, because as a popular paradigm, it wasn't familiar to people. Now, certainly, when we think about abolition, its roots are deep in American history and deep in Black history. What does police abolition mean? So, very simply, police abolition is about shifting resources from punishment, right, and coercion and containment to other systems and institutions and relationships that build up the capacity of people and communities that aren't extractive. And so when we think about police abolition, we're thinking about policing, but we're actually thinking outside the paradigm of policing. And so we are thinking about addressing racial inequality. We are thinking about housing inequality and the legacy of that. We are thinking about economic inequality and the kind of short-term and long-term consequences of that. And so it can be hard for people to kind of make sense of what it is as a kind of long-term political project. But what's important for people to understand is that when you're thinking about police abolition, you're actually pushing back against the paradigm of policing. And you're working outside of the paradigm of policing to address things like safety and well-being for people and communities.
Is that even possible when we're looking at a militarized police force now? I mean, all the new weapons, we have AI, we have these robot dogs going into neighborhoods, in poor neighborhoods. How possible, how realistic is police abolition in this day and age, considering what folks are up against?
Yeah.
Is it are they too big for us to even, suggest they stop being so violent because of our budget? I mean, the largest pot of money we give to people is the defense budget. So how possible is this?
Yeah.
Police unions are incredibly strong. It seems like we're separate entities. It is the police against the people. They pretend community policing is in the middle, but the way things are going and all the victims of police brutality that you noted in your speech are clear evidence of that we do have a problem.
Yeah.
So how realistic is police abolitionist in this over-militarized police state that we're currently in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know it's possible because people are doing it, right? So police abolition is both a near-term and a long-term project. And so even over the last few years, we've seen experimentation and innovation when it comes to mutual aid, when it comes to developing responses to crises that don't involve armed officers. These are the kinds of things that were happening and have been happening. People have been thinking about this, certainly for the last 20 years and longer, that in this moment, there was more support for. And so we see things, for example, like Mental Health First in Oakland, California, where I live. And this is a crisis response organization that relies on volunteers, trains volunteers. It was started by the Anti-Police Terror Project in Oakland, and there's one in Sacramento and Oakland as well. And it relies on the resources of the community to respond to crisis. Why is that important? It's important, one, because you are building community as you are training community and you're asking community members to respond. But it's also important because then police officers aren't there. And it shows that they are not needed and not necessary. And we know those are some of the most volatile encounters that police can be involved with. And so we can imagine that it's saving lives as well, right? And so that kind of experimentation, one of the things I've learned for the last 3 years is that people aren't going to wait for the permission of the police to push for police abolition, right? And we're going to learn a lot from them for the crisis next time, right? And the experiments that are happening now and the innovations that are happening now, those are going to rise to the fore the next crisis, right? After the next crisis. And unfortunately, there will be a next crisis because so much of the effort has been into reform, and we know that reform is not going to solve this problem. So we will have future opportunities to respond and to show what police abolition can be.
Colin Kaepernick came at this specific issue a little differently. He took a knee and did not want to salute the flag, or he basically turned his back. And we all saw what the police did, what a lot of folks did, what the right did, and they almost changed that narrative. He was talking about stopping police brutality, but it morphed into something else. So, what? Are you facing this issue too? Will we face this issue? I mean, you're taking, this is about taking a knee, so to speak, but are you afraid that it will be turned into something else and it'll be like an attack on the police?
Oh yeah, I think that one of the things I've learned from studying policing over the last decade for sure is that it's an institution that is centered on this kind of masculinist control of violence. And it is at the same time one of the most fragile institutions, right? And so if you launch any criticism about the police, right, there is this huge pushback and a punishment. And what we've seen more recently is that it's even, you could even be categorized as un-American, right, for not liking the police. And what I try to get people to think of analytically, right, is that it's not about liking the police. It's not about individuals, individual police officers, if they're good or bad, if they're bad apples, right, and so on. It is about policing as an institution, right? It's history in the U.S. It's history in policing, punishing, containing, and killing black people. And as an academic in the work that I do, knowing what I know in this moment, it only makes sense to present that analysis, right? To share that. Those are the skills that I have. And so, is there likely to be pushback? Absolutely. And yet, abolition requires, one of the things I've learned, a confrontation with state violence. Right? There are people, there are activists, organizers in the street who are sitting right at the crosshairs, who have the guns pointed in their faces. That's not the work that I'm doing, right? That's a different kind of work. But what I have the skills to do is the work that I'm doing in this way, right? And I do think that as academics who have been, the academy has been very much invested in the expansion of enforcement and legitimizing law enforcement, that we do have a responsibility to also confront that violence of policing. You cannot talk about policing if you're not talking about the violence of policing.
What about the other side? Should the community who are being policed, do they also have to have a change in order for this initiative to be successful?
Again, I learned from the community, and so when I think about my second book project, and I was studying violence and what happens after people who have spent years, tied to the street decide to change their lives, and so you have to talk about violence, you have to talk about policing. But one of the things that I've learned is that so much of what we would want to be there is already there, right? So people do look out for themselves, their families. There's organic caretaking work that happens in every community that is totally overshadowed, especially by the media coverage of crime and violence. We do not have an accurate understanding. Most people do not have an accurate understanding of what's happening in communities because they're not there. And the violence is real, right? But we don't need minds that are clouded by fear making decisions about what we do in response to that violence, right? We need folks who are experts, who are wise, right, who have knowledge, right, in those communities. And at the same time, there's going to be disagreement there because folks in the community don't agree necessarily on everything. And I've written about that as well. But that's a much stronger starting point than starting from fear, right? Fear-driven politics, racial politics, racist politics, right? And it damages individuals, it damages families, it damages communities.
So the media plays a big role, and it's going to play a big role.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Final question. This will be your DC question. You are visiting us from Oakland, California. Have you visited any of our museums?
Not on this trip. Yeah, but one of my favorites is the National Portrait Gallery, and I love the folk art exhibit. And one of the things that I love about it is you go and you see how everyday people, right, express, like, just felt compelled, right, to express, themselves through art, right? And I'm particularly moved by an exhibit I saw last time, and I believe it was a woman who was living through Jim Crow and had decorated her cabin, right? And, you think about the role of art in imagining, right, a new world, a world, what James Baldwin would describe as an elsewhere, right? And doing that where you are, I think that's super consistent with an abolitionist spirit.
I love that, and I love that you mentioned the portrait gallery as part of that imagining and the new spirit of less police violence, which I hope comes to fruition. Anything else I haven't asked that you think is important to know?
No, thank you. I appreciate this opportunity. Yeah.
Of course, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.